Hi everybody, I'm Holly Radford-James. I'm producer for Mac Makes Music, which is a community music program based in the Midlands Arts Centre in Birmingham. It works across the West Midlands. I'm also on the board for Sound Sense, and today we've got another Training the Community Musician conversation, and I'm joined by the really wonderful Anne Jones, who is an amazing musician who happens to also be a freelancer on the Mac Makes Music team as well. But Anne, I might just hand over you to introduce yourself, please.
Thank you, Holly. That was a very lovely introduction. So I'm a community musician, freelancer, working with the wonderful Mac Makes Music, but also with a wide variety of projects. And I guess my main focus is being participant led and helping participants find their musical voice and gain agency through their musical voice. So part of my work is working within SEMH and young people who've been excluded. So I've spent a lot of years working within PRUs and finding ways of working that really suit the young people and consulting with the young people so that the music making we're doing is really led by them and they feel ownership of it. And I would say that's a practice that I use across my work because I work with a wide range of different groups. I think as many freelancers do, we have many strands to our work because of the nature of the work, because it is always, there are pots of funding and they come to an end. So it's important within my work that I keep things going and try to make sure that the work that I'm doing can continue. So the Prue work, I've been really lucky to be supported by Mac Makes Music after doing that as a freelancer on various arts projects. And the SEMH work, at the moment I'm doing that in a variety of settings, which I think really enables young people to re-engage with education, to re-engage socially. And doing that through music is a real privilege and a pleasure.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And do you have a main instrument that you play, or sort of what's your approach around that?
So the main instrument that I play is the violin. I was very lucky at school to have free lessons on the violin, and I continued having a number of bursaries because I come from a working class background. And by the time I got to music college, I was very classically based, and I defected from that in in my early 20s and went into a more improvisatory rock pop approach because basically I felt like a bit of a fish out of water in the world of classical music because the college that I ended up at, it wasn't really somewhere that was used to having people from my type of background. So I think that's what's given me a real passion for community music, is making things accessible to all people and inclusive. So now I've also learned I play the piano, I play the guitar, not very well, but that's okay. I'm working towards that, and I've developed my singing. So I try to develop the instruments and the music that the people that I'm working with want to do.
Hmm. Brilliant. Thank you very much. And so you've touched on this already, but how did you come to your practice, and what training, if any, did you have to engage you on your journey?
Yeah, that's a good question. So coming from the background I did, and I'm really really lucky, and I still love classical music. I still love playing my violin. I play it in a variety of different ways. I feel really grateful to the music services that taught me and the fact that I could access that for free. But by the time I'd finished my studies, I'd met a lot of community artists. So I would say my initial engagement with community arts was through community drama. I was very lucky to live with a woman who was very engaged with community drama and introduced me to people like welfare state and different devised theatre approaches. And that's where I really started doing community music, although I was unaware that that's what I was doing at the time, because I was more involved in the community drama and the cross art form side of things. So I did a lot of devised performances, experimented with improvising and helping participants to improvise and following their musical creations. So I think I've continued with that along the way, and then started to realise that actually there was a world of community music within the freelance arts world, and the training that I've done has tended to be either things like music leader, which was great, but I came to that quite a lot later in my journey than some other people, so I didn't really have that when I was starting out as a community musician. I've learned a lot from music educationalists. I've learned a lot from reading an awful lot of books and looking at songbooks, resources. So I think a lot of it was self-taught. I think there is more provision now. But I've learned a lot of things from people outside of music as well, so from different art forms, from people working within the healthcare sector, from social workers, youth workers. I think there's so many intersections within the practice of community music, that there are so many people and practices that we can learn from that then help inform our work and make it even better.
Amazing. I'm really interested in what you said about learning from people sort of outside of the music world. Has that been sort of through collaborative projects, or I don't know, just exploring different avenues? You've mentioned like the social work and those sort of the healthcare settings.
Definitely through collaboration. So I was very, very lucky to work with Pin Stockman, who's an amazing practitioner who works within drama, storytelling. And we did a lot of devised performances together and with a lot of other artists, and worked with various theatres. So we were given free rein to create. The whole emphasis was on creating and enabling participants to create. And also an emphasis on process rather than product, which
Yeah.
just takes so much pressure off looking at making a piece that has to be rehearsed and refined, and it's exploring. So that explorative part of devising is something that I've really embraced in my work. Within healthcare, I'm very lucky to have worked within hospitals and within palliative care settings. And within that, I've learnt so much from the staff, whether they're play care staff, whether they're wellbeing staff, learning about the various conditions that people are living with and how best to enable them to experience and express themselves through music.
Great. Thank you very much, Anne. So what does training mean to you in the context of community music?
That's that's a really interesting question. I think training to me is a really, really broad thing, and I think there is so much that you can find on YouTube, within community music groups that are on social media. There's so much now that you can do as a self-starter, and I think that's really important, because that means that essentially if you've got access to the internet, which I know not everyone has, but if you've got access, then you can do so much learning on your
Yeah.
own. And I think that's a really great thing in terms of inclusivity, that we can do things from home and we can learn from other people in that way. I think there's a real importance in community music of having some training and having some looking at the different methodologies that we use and the strategies that we use within the work. So I think in terms of training, we can learn an awful lot from all music educationalists, and I think there's a great need for us to work together more with music therapists, with teachers working within music, with music hub staff and community musicians, because we can learn so much from each other.
Hmm.
So I think a lot of the time there are things that are separated out that perhaps need to be more combined, so that we can learn together and we can actually learn from each other the different ways that we're working. Because sometimes separating things out, although you can become very specialised and go really in depth, there's a broader element of music education, and I think there's a great need for us to be understanding all the different wonderful practices that are happening. I think within community music, one of the barriers to training is that as a freelancer, you're working from project to project. So you're
Yeah.
not salaried. And I think that has big implications. If you're working within an education setting and you've got a salary, if you're working as a music therapist and you're salaried, which is not always the case, I do know that, not always the case within music therapy, or you're working with a music hub and you have a salary, it's a very different reason for training than if you're a community musician. You may not have the time, you may be giving up a day, which is when you could be earning wages. And if that training isn't directly linked to a project, is purely for your own development, it can feel like a risk to take a day off.
Yeah.
So I think there are financial implications that we need to look at. I also think that in
Hmm.
terms of training, we really need to look at people that we're working with within community music, and looking at the faces, because I do a lot of training, looking at the faces of trainers and their backgrounds, and looking at whether the people who are coming through and training to be the next generation of community musicians are really truly representative of the people that we're working with.
Mhm.
And if they're not, we need to look at why. And
Yeah.
I think there are wonderful organisations who are doing that, are really trying to do that. And I think these conversations are a great way of starting to open up that conversation.
Mhm.
I think there are still many people from working class backgrounds, there are many people of colour, there are many people with additional needs and neurodiversity that are not making it into the room. They're not making it into the training room. And if they're not, then we need to find out why that's happening.
Mhm.
And I think part of that will be access, and part of that will be intimidation of a training setting
Mhm.
for some people, and intimidation of the perceived, people may have had a very poor experience of education, so not want to go into an area of work where they're perceived as educators.
Mhm.
There are so many challenges, and some of them are financial as well. So I think we really need
Yeah.
to look at that to get a more representative workforce,
Mm.
and to have trainers who are more representative of the people we are working with too.
Yeah.
So while I think we're starting to establish paths by having people coming from community music projects who've been participants and then taking a step up to being leaders, I think there are people we're missing. There are voices that are missing within that. And that's something that we can continue to unpick, but definitely needs to be addressed.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. And it's interesting, you kind of mentioned a whole array of sort of what you would put underneath the banner of like training, I guess, for community musicians, everything from like self-teaching, looking at other people online, to more sort of organized like training sessions, and then all of the um issues around that as a freelance workforce, and being able to financially commit to things if they're not sort of paid for through a project that you're working on. That kind of like links to the next question, which is what are the advantages and dangers of training community musicians?
This is a really interesting question, isn't it? And it really comes down to what your definition of community music is, which is an
Mm.
ongoing debate. And I'm not going to leap into that at the moment. But I would say one of the advantages of training is that you can stop feeling isolated as a practitioner. So I worked for many years feeling quite on my own, isolated, not meeting many people who were doing similar things to me. They were doing things in other art forms. I met dancers, I met drama workers, but I wasn't meeting many musicians. So for me, part of training is meeting other people that are doing similar things to you. Because
Hmm.
I think that connectivity and finding commonalities can really strengthen what you're doing and can help to link you to a network of new projects, new contacts. And I think that sharing is really important. So I think one of the advantages is building your identity as a community musician and finding the community of community musicians, local and national to you, and worldwide
Yeah.
as well. I think that sharing of practice and whatever training you've gone to, that the community that comes with that is really, really important. The
Hmm.
conversations that happen away from the training are often as valid as what's happening within the training room.
Yeah.
I think there are other too. I think within most jobs you train to develop yourself, and I think within as a musician it's incredibly important to develop your own music making skills as well as your facilitating skills.
Mm.
I think there are lots of things that can be taught. So we can look at things like inclusivity, diversity, reading the room. There's so many things that we can look at and be trained in that can help us to develop our practice and get to where we really want to go. Because I think with the ultimate aim for me of training is for people to find their own musical voice as a leader.
Yeah.
So as a community music practitioner, you find your own voice by finding games, finding activities that you use, finding the groups that you work with. And community music is often an act of subversion, of dissent. It's looking at people who are missing from the main conversation. So I think that's where the dangers comes in, that perhaps it might be perceived that training people leads to a certain approach that's going to
Mm.
squash individuality, that's going to squash creativity. And I don't think it has to do that.
Hmm.
I think that can be a perception. Often community music can be a political act. It can be an act of rebellion, maybe, and that's something that is within community music. And I don't think training will necessarily make that. less of an individual voice or a rebellious voice. That's a
Mm.
long conversation to have, though. So
It's
I've
really
opened
interesting, though.
I've opened that out, but I think that's something that really needs to be looked at in depth. But I think training can be really, really helpful. One of the dangers of training, I think, is that perhaps larger organisations see the benefits of a community music approach and would like their staff to work in that way, but have not necessarily consulted with their staff about whether they want to work in a community
Mm.
music setting or way, whether they want to work in a more improvising way, or whether they want to work within more challenging settings. So there's a danger of taking a workforce and saying we want you to work like this, and I think people, you know, the way that you want to work, you find your own musical way of working, so it's not
Yeah.
for everyone. And I worry about some organisations wanting their staff to go in that direction without actually talking and consulting with their staff.
Mm.
And I also worry about some, a lot of people have come and shadowed me over the years, and I've mentored a lot of people, and I've seen some people taking away maybe plans, maybe things that I've done that they've seen work with one group, and they've tried to do it with another group and it hasn't worked, or they've tried to do it
Yeah.
with another group, or they've taken that template and they'll just use it everywhere. And part of what I do, and what I think many community musicians do, is to have bespoke sessions that really reflect the people that you're working with. So there's a
Yeah.
danger of watering down and making things formulaic by taking the process from one artist and taking it and trying to use it in many different settings.
Mm.
I think that's I think that can be, that can take the practice and take it out of context.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I mean, how would you or can you train somebody to be able to offer bespoke work and to, like you said, take each group and work with who's in the room and it be very person centered.
And again, I think this is partly training and it's also partly funding. So it's,
Okay.
someone can know that to have a really successful session with a group that may be underserved, may be more vulnerable, or a group in mainstream, if you want a really participant led approach, then you are going to have to go away and do work outside the session. And that needs to be paid for.
Hmm.
So if a project is funded purely on, say, 2 hours a week, but the approach wanted is to be really person centred and group owned, then that musician is going to have to do a lot of work outside to make it really bespoke, because that's the point of bespoke work. You go away and you plan it and you keep changing it according to the group, and you're really flexible.
Mm,
And while you can teach that approach, the when the project's templates are written out, they really need to reflect that the time away from the group is going to be just as valuable as the time with the group.
yeah.
So I think you can teach the approach, and I think there will be some people who really, really engage with that and really want to do that, and others that maybe not so much.
Yeah.
And I think that's okay. There are lots of ways of working within music
Mm,
education and within the whole music learning sphere. So I do think you can teach the approach of being participant led, and a lot of it is stopping your own voice and listening to the voices of other people.
mm,
And sometimes having silence in the room so people have thinking time.
yeah. Yeah. Oh, thank you. That's really interesting. Really interesting about the dangers and how you said that it can be perceived if you're training somebody that they lose their own voice or their own take on something, but actually it can be done where you can train somebody and they can still have their own way of doing things and their own space within an approach. That's really interesting. Thank you, Anne.
I think maybe some community music, within training, it's really important for trainers to think about encouraging people to find their own individual leading voice as much as it's as we naturally encourage participants to have their musical voice.
Yeah.
And it's a conversation that maybe hasn't been had as much as it should.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah, and you mentioned earlier as well about having your own artistic voice and you're facilitating practice and making sure you're developing both of those as well. That's really interesting.
Yeah, I think your musical skills. I really like Ken Robinson's The Element and Ken Robinson's TED Talks and Ken Robinson generally, just because of that talking about you having a passion for something. And most
Yeah.
musicians that I meet, they have a passion for music and they want to share that with people. And that's the spark of community music, I think. And I think that's why the question of the danger of training comes up a lot, because there's the worry of taking that spark and dampening it down by giving rules and things that you
Mm,
must do and things that you must avoid. But I think keeping that spark going for all musicians is really, really important. Keeping widening what you're doing, keeping performing can be really
yeah.
important. And I think that can be very difficult to manage that balance. But if you're going to ask young people or older people or vulnerable groups to get up on stage, which not all of us ask that to happen. There's often projects that have no performance element at all. But if you are, for example, working on something where performance is an element, I think it's important for you to still be doing that too, to have experience of that, to know how that feels, to engage with the nerves that you get. And if we're going to have expectations of people musically, I think it's important that we are working on those musical elements ourselves, because you never stop
Mm,
being a musician, you never stop learning. I think Yo-Yo Ma said something about, I'm always learning, I've never stopped learning, I'm still learning. I think there's other musicians that I've read really inspiring comments where they're in their 80s, they're still learning, because
yeah.
there's still so much to learn. And whatever level you've reached, we're all on a musical journey. And in
Hmm.
community music, what I really like is the fact that we're going there together.
Yeah.
You don't come in as the expert and go, this is what I wouldn't go, this is what I can do, play my violin and go, and I can show you how to do that too. It's not about that. It's about, I'm here in my musical journey, you're where you are in your musical journey, and we can carry on that journey together, making music together in an equitable way.
Mm,
And I like that lack of hierarchy, that community that comes with that. But I'm
yeah.
aware that that lack of hierarchy sometimes leads to structural differences and difficulties, because if there is no hierarchy, then it's very difficult to say who's progressing. So if we are training people and they're getting better and better, where are they progressing to? And within organisations, this is particularly true during the pandemic for freelancers, a huge time of struggle, because those projects have gone, furlough not really available for many people. And within community arts, I think generally within community arts, the salaried positions are not necessarily those of the freelance musicians. This
Yeah.
is across the music industry as well. It's not solely community music, but there are those issues to look at that are structural, and we really need to address how we can go forward.
Mm. Yeah, there's loads to unpick there, isn't
It's a
there?
big question, isn't it? And I
Yeah,
definitely haven't got all the answers, but I think together we can go a long way to making structures and systems that work for everybody.
absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Um, moving on. So if all community musicians had to develop three attributes or skills, what do you think they would be?
That's a really hard question.
Yeah.
So I have thought about that question,
Hmm.
and I think the first one is a really simple. What are you going to do? So when we're providing training, what do people need to be able to do to run a community music project? So there are the obvious things of practical activities, musical activities, ways to songwrite, ways to engage with people, ways to facilitate so people can find their own musical voice and have musical agency. And there are so many wonderful warm-ups, practical activities, ways of doing things, creative games. And I think you end up with a whole backpack that you can pick things out of.
Mm,
And I think that's really important, because if you've got that whole range of activities, then when you have to be really flexible and suddenly change in a session, which you very often have to, due to challenges in the room or someone saying, well, what about this? I think that becomes a lot easier to use those frameworks. So
yeah.
if you've got that really strong setting of frameworks and you've developed your own musical practice and you've consulted with the group, then I think you can have really strong sessions and the training will really, really pay off then. That what also comes into, I think, learning styles. So if you're learning warm-ups and practical activities, then you can adapt those once you've read the room and looked at who's in there to different learning styles. And I
Mm.
think that's really important too, to look for creativity, not compliance within your sessions,
Yeah.
so that you've got a huge range of resources to draw on so you can be as flexible as possible. So that's my first one, I think. The next is sort of the what of what you're doing. So it would
Hmm.
be how you're developing as a practitioner. So for me, that might be finding your own musical identity. I've talked about this a little
Yeah.
bit before. So you might have lived experiences. So for me, it's as someone who's working class, who has a great interest in gender issues, in neurodiversity, in mental health. And it's how you use those passions and take that into what you're doing and make it
Hmm.
relevant and understand and empathize with the people that you're working with. And I think some of that can be learnt. So you can learn about different learning styles, you can learn about different abilities and how to best facilitate for them. You can learn about how to best facilitate, because there is so much wonderful writing on different ways of educating, different ways of teaching. Rita Pearson is one of my heroes. Rita Pearson, if people haven't looked, Rita Pearson talks about every child needs an advocate, and she makes some amazing points. I would like to read far more of what she's done. There are so many people writing about ways of working, and
Hmm.
I think exploring that and having training on those different ways and then finding your way and your passions is really, really important to your musical identity as a community musician, to be able to work with the wider community around you. Part of
Yeah.
that is also reflective practice.
Hmm.
So I would say that within that, there's training on inclusion, there's training on diversity and learning styles. This is a big lot of training, but all
Yeah.
in one section. I'm being really cheeky here.
Yeah.
But I would say reflective practice is really part of that.
Hmm.
So looking at what you're doing and being able to be really honest, and hopefully with someone else being able to be really honest about that didn't work, why didn't it work? Or that worked,
Mm.
why did it work? What did I do there? Having the time to be
Yeah.
able to look back and build your work as a practitioner. And I think
Hmm.
there are ways of doing that to make that really comfortable for each community musician and community artist who's working on a project. Everyone has different ways of doing that, and you definitely have to have a level of trust within training to do that.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of people are worried about unpicking their practice because they think it will make them look like less of a practitioner. And when you're working financially from one project to another, you want to seem like the best practitioner you can. And to be honest and go, something
Yeah.
didn't work there, is a really difficult thing to do, particularly with people who might be paying your wages.
Yeah. Yeah. Completely.
So I think that's a really good thing to look at. I think that's something that Mac Makes Music are really good at supporting, because you support a wide range of people evaluating and reflecting on their work in a really supported, trusted way. And I think that's something that a lot of organisations could learn from. But I think it's something that every community musician and artist really does need the time to do. And again,
Mm.
if you are going to reflect as part of your development, then that probably needs to be included in wages in a project too.
Yeah.
And whether you're going to do that orally, whether you're going to be someone that enjoys writing, there are so many ways that we can use that
Hmm.
incorporate different people's learning styles and abilities so that everybody can reflect and grow. I think that's
Yeah.
really important.
Yeah. Yeah. Completely.
I think I had a third one. I think my third one is who you're working with,
Yeah.
and training on. For me, this would I don't know if you can quite. I think you can be trained on this. I think it would be identifying where you as a musician want to take your projects. So
Okay.
we talked about training sometimes missing. Sometimes there are people who aren't getting into the room.
Hmm.
So when we're devising projects, there are people who aren't reaching our projects. There are people that we want to reach that maybe we need to apply for individual funding to get for. So I would say an understanding of community arts, community music, and how the systems of funding work, and
Yeah.
how that if there's a project you really want to do, find a way to do it. I think people need to be trained in that also.
Mm. Yeah. That's interesting.
So I think training sessions in, if you as a community musician could do anything you wanted to do, what would you do? So I've trained so many people who are going from one job to another, and they're very stressed.
Mm,
They're very stressed, and they haven't had the time to go, well, actually, this is my ideal project. So I think training that
yeah.
involves an element of well-being, looking at how you balance your life, looking at the pressures of being a freelancer and
Hmm.
what you would do in your ideal world. Because if you've had the time to visualize what your ideal project would be, you can then approach different organizations. You can start to look at
Yeah.
making that happen. And it's possibly a cheeky one to put into training, but I think that just being training in well-being and looking at where you want to be in the next year, where you want to be in the next 5 years, I think it's a really hard thing to do on your own. I think it's a lot easier to do in a facilitated space.
Mm,
And
hmm.
I think that's a really important thing that often in other areas of education, teachers do have some time where they're asked, where would you like to be in 5 years? What would you like to do? What would help you get there? Who do you want to be working with? And in community
Yeah.
music, I don't think we quite have that. And I think that's possibly again due to systems
Hmm.
and structures of funding. But I think being able to be an idealist, even if it's just for half a day, and go, this is what I'd do if I could do anything and there was all the money in the world. Once you've got that idea in your head, it's sown a seed, and you can start to make that happen. And I think that would mean we would be end up reaching far more people
Hmm.
than we currently are.
Mm. Lots of food for thought there. Thank you. Thank you, Anne. Um, is there anything else you wanted to mention about sort of training community musicians? I'm quite interested in just how you've mentioned all the different ways that you could train somebody and things that can be trained, which maybe other people think maybe can't. Yeah, I don't know if you had somebody approach you who is new to the field, what would your first reaction, instinct, response be to them if they said, how do I train to become a community musician, or what should I do next?
I think I would tell them to get I would point them in the direction of many wonderful organisations that can help and support. I would also ask them exactly, what they wanted to be doing,
Hmm.
and then try to support them as much as possible by finding mentoring, by finding shadowing opportunities, by finding
Hmm.
in some cases volunteering opportunities, so they can really progress on that path and gain as much experience as possible. And
Hmm.
I think for a lot of people the main worry does it still becomes financial.
Yeah.
So I think there is a place for training within freelancers on being self-employed
Hmm.
and managing that world, because it's something that you tend to have to learn on your own, and that's that's quite tricky for a lot of people. Learning how to file your accounts for HMRC, learning how to keep a track of what you're
Mm,
doing, and although that seems outside the remit of what you're actually doing, it is an integral part of it.
yeah.
So I think that would be really important. I would say also there's an issue of visibility as a
Hmm.
profession. So I think a lot of, when it comes to secondary schools, maybe if people were offered as part of work experience on a community music project,
Hmm.
I think that would be a wonderful thing. Then we would have more visibility as a profession, as a viable job. And I think we're not a job that gets included when people start to look at specialising.
Yeah.
So it's an area that's still fairly hidden. People
Mm,
might think of musician and think become a performer, become a teacher, but they don't think of becoming a community musician because they don't know what it is. So if we could become more visible within schools, within employment opportunities, within higher education, and within job centres,
yeah.
within anywhere where people are looking at what area do I want to work in,
Hmm.
and that's a huge thing to do. But I think starting off with secondary schools and in primary schools too, and maybe within the music studios, because there are an awful lot of self-taught musicians at music studios who are absolutely brilliant. They're playing in their bands and they don't know about community music, and it might be something that's really for them. So I
Yeah.
think having visibility within universities, music colleges, I didn't know when I went to music college there was any such thing as community music. It wouldn't have occurred to me, and I think that's improved. I don't think it's improved enough. I think our visibility needs to be far higher, and our profile needs to be far higher within employment.
Mm. Oh, there's so much to unpick there. It's
Really
interesting
is.
about like trying to give people opportunities to shadow, to be mentored, to get physical experience, and how tricky that can be if there isn't paid roles of to do that, if people are looking for sort of already experienced trusted, I guess, pairs of hands to deliver projects. It doesn't leave much room if there aren't sort of roles which are more supported, I guess. So that's really interesting as well, I guess. Yeah, the best way to learn in some situations is just to do, isn't it, and to learn as you go.
Definitely, I think there's an awful lot to be said for learning as you go. And sometimes I've met some people who are they're so used to working in a supporting role that they're very afraid of taking the next step.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
So there is a lot to be said for solo working and learning from being the leader.
Yeah.
I think that's something that I did, and you do have moments where you think, "What am I doing? Am I doing this right?" But immediately you're engaging with your reflective practitioner self, and I'm not sure that that happens when you're supporting as much, because you're far more
Yeah.
looking at what somebody else is doing and whether they're doing it right or not,
Yeah.
or you're assuming that their way of doing it will be your way of doing it. So I think that's
Yeah.
really interesting. And I mean, certainly if you're an NQT, you're in at the deep end. You have a class and you learn your behaviour management. You learn your voice. You learn your way of working in a bit of a baptism of fire, really,
Yeah.
which I think most people find quite scary. But so I suppose, yes, something else you could encourage people to do is do the things that are a bit scary,
Mm.
because that is another way of getting to another level. Is by doing
Yeah.
something that actually you feel a little bit uncomfortable about doing. One of the things that I did during lockdown, which which I know you know about, was taking challenges from young people.
Yeah.
Because to keep young people engaged and coming back to sessions online is very difficult. So I took challenges. I did things like learn a TikTok dance. That is not within my comfort zone. I created a rap and all sorts of things that the young people really enjoyed going, huh, why don't you do this? But taking those challenges and taking risks is really important. One of the things I think I've learned along the way is to go with the things that I'm really interested in. So I'm really interested in gender issues, and have been working with newly arrived women and women who've experienced domestic violence and domestic abuse, and having some women only sessions where women get to write songs and express themselves and explore well-being and commonalities, and then share those songs with a wider group of people to gain agency, to gain a voice in community.
Mm.
And that's been another leap of faith. Is this needed? Is there, will we be able to do this? And we are doing it. We've been doing it for 3 years, and it's progressing, and that's it's a wonderful thing. But it's quite hard to take those risks and go, I really want to do this, so let's set it up.
Yeah.
And I think again, it's really important to consult with the people in your community about what they want,
Yeah.
because there's no point setting up a project that no one wants.
Very true.
But that's very difficult in terms of funding. And
Mhm.
often with funders, you have to prove that participants do want something. So there needs to be a little bit of an R&D phase within community funding, as there often is certainly within developing a show.
Yeah.
There tends to be an R&D funded phase. There don't tend to be R&D funded phases within setting up community music or community arts projects. You are meant to do that consultation voluntarily, and that gives a definite finance barrier to many people,
Yeah.
which is again why we're seeing so many excluded voices in the face of community music, I think.
Hmm.
That's a big barrier. And then if you have to write funding applications, that's a really complex thing to do that will exclude many people again.
Mm.
It's a really difficult. I mean, I think community music is a really beautiful thing, and it's also it's far wider than what I do. There are so many approaches, and I think just the sense of getting together and being really kind and generous to each other and listening to what each other do and appreciate that is really important too. I would
Hmm.
encourage anyone who's new to community music to talk to as many people as possible. and to look at as many different ways of working as possible, because what one person does might really not be your thing, and you might think, oh, I'm not doing that, that's community music. But actually, there are so many different projects going on, and there will be something, hopefully, for everyone.
Absolutely. Well, that's a really nice way to sort of round it off, and just to remind people that you can start doing that through Sound Sense as well, and the gatherings that happen online monthly, and the sounding board journals always got really interesting things to hear about everybody's different approaches and different projects and programs they're working on, and come to train the community musician as well, and then to carry on these conversations, because there is so much interesting things to unpick. But thank you ever so much for your time, Anne. It's really appreciated. It's been really lovely to listen to you talk about your experiences and everything you're thinking about, and everything related to training community musicians. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.